Chapter 1 on the way home. The Strait of Malacca passed 3 days ago, and the Buckingham ocean tanker is now sailing in the waters of the Nansha Islands. The high temperature near the equator is gradually getting better, and the subtropical early spring sea breeze blowing from the north is warm and comfortable. Although the long journey was coming to an end and the air at this moment was comfortable, a young man in his early 20s still looked sad on the side of the second-class deck of the Buckingham. His name is Wu Xiaoding. He just graduated from the 6th Military Academy in Munich a year ago. He also served as an intern in the Macedonian army for more than half a year. It was not until 2 months ago that he boarded the cruise ship returning to his motherland from the UK. Wu Xiaoding had never believed in time travel before. As a member of the 21st Century Special Forces, he rarely even read online novels of this type. How could he have known that such a magical thing would happen to him? He only remembered that he was hit in the chest by a stray bullet during a live-fire exercise 4 months ago. This was not a big deal. He was wearing a 12-pound steel plate body armor, but when he woke up, he found that he was in a dormitory of a military camp in Munich, and his soul was possessed by a person with the same name. What's even more surprising is that he has a very ridiculous braid on his head. That's right, Wu Xiaoding traveled through time to the late Qing dynasty. The current time is March 3rd, 1908. 4 months have passed since this incident. Of course, he has adapted to this identity, and during the last internship assessment in Germany, he also used his 21st century military qualities to achieve extremely excellent results. At this time, in the cabin suitcase, there was also a Browning M1904 pistol awarded by Captain Philip. The reason why he is worried now is that he is worried about China in 1908 and his own future. Anyone who has read a little history knows that the thrilling revolution of 1911 and the Warlord War that lasted for more than 20 years are about to begin on the land of China. What can a time traveler do before the troubled times are approaching? Wu Xiaoding looked at the bleak sunset on the sea level and couldn't help but sigh. A sentence suddenly came to his mind, and he murmured it. The revolution has not yet succeeded. Comrades still have to work hard. Alas! At this moment, a question suddenly popped up from behind. Friend, aren't you afraid that these words will lead to death? The accent of the words was thick Cantonese accent. Wu Xiaoding was slightly startled and quickly turned around to look around. He saw a young man wearing a long gown and a pair of black-rimmed glasses standing behind him. He was very thin and about 30 years old. He didn't know when this man appeared. There was an elusive smile on the young man's lips, staring straight at Wu Xiaoding in front of him. Wu Xiaoding looked at the other person for a while, smiled calmly, and said, "If what I said before has the risk of death, then, sir, if you even cut off your braids, wouldn't it be the same disaster?" The young man did not make any rebuttal, but laughed loudly and said, "What surprised me is that this young master is talking about driving away the Tartars, but he still has the relics of the Tartars on his head. Isn't this a contradiction?" Wu Xiaoding sighed, calmed down his emotions, and said worriedly, "I have wanted to cut it off for a long time. The Tartars have corrupted my strong man's mind. What are you keeping it for? Unfortunately, I have my own reasons. I am not as open-minded as you students studying abroad. Otherwise, I would not keep it to this day." Since the failure of the reform movement of 1898, many young intellectuals in China have begun to cut off their braids privately, especially in the southern provinces beyond the reach of the Qing government. In addition to students, even the soldiers of a new army formed by the Manchu Qing government secretly cut off their braids to facilitate the wearing of new military caps. Although the Manchu and Qing government had a strict order to keep your braids but not your hair, since the Sino-Japanese War and the Gingzi Indemnity, the central imperial power of Japan has become increasingly weak. Local forces and the foreign concessions in China have become hotbeds of resistance to this strict order. But 10 out of 10 students who study abroad will cut off their braids. Just in 1907, just last year, the Manchu Qing government was worried about this increasingly serious problem and once again issued a strict order prohibiting private cutting of braids. It's just that this strict order was like a bad check. It was only lively for a while and then disappeared without a trace. Oh, so, sir, you're no longer a student studying abroad? The young man asked curiously. Although I have returned from studying abroad, I am slightly different from my husband. I have just graduated from the 6th Sergeant Academy in Munich. Wu Shouting explained. That's it. The young man nodded suddenly. In the late Qing dynasty, many Chinese people went abroad to explore how to make the country rich and powerful. In addition to going to regular academic universities abroad, military academies were also very popular. However, the difference from academic universities is that academic universities have both government-funded and self-funded students, while military academy students only have government-funded students. It's easy to understand. Military learning is no small matter. If you can't use it for the country after you finish it, what use will you have? In addition, academic universities do not necessarily have to report to the government after studying abroad, so these students can cut off their braids and have no serious problems after returning home. However, students who have returned from military academies are all assigned positions by the government. If they cut off their braids, their career will be affected even if they're not killed. The young man pondered for a while and then said with a smile, looking at the accent, "It seems that you are both from Cantonese, sir?" Chapter 2 returned from Nanyang. Wu Shouting replied, "My ancestral home is on Hue, and I moved to Jiangsu with my parents. When I was young, I was admitted to the Guangzhou Army Primary School, so I lived alone in Guangzhou for several years. Later, on the recommendation of my uncle Wu Chongqing's old army, I traveled across the ocean to study in Germany." These words are not made up by Wu Shouting, but all come from the memory of this body. When he first found out that he was related by blood to Wu Chongqing, he was also very surprised. He secretly thanked God for being kind to him and for being able to win the status of a famous general. But later he gradually realized that the only help the status gave him was to recommend himself to study in Germany at official expense, and nothing else. The young man was a little surprised and sighed. It turns out to be the queen of the old hero Wu. Disrespectful. Wu Shouting said with a self-deprecating smile, "After being a hero, I am not a hero. I am not a person who seeks fame and fame. Alas, in this era, we need to turn the tide." After hearing this, the young man gradually felt good in his heart and couldn't help but said, "Young Master Wu really has great ambitions?" Wu Shouting sighed. "Since the Opium War, our huge country has been suffering from internal and external troubles. Who among the 7-foot-old men doesn't want to find a way out, strengthen ourselves, and save the country? If we don't fight, we will become slaves of the country sooner or later. Because of this, I have the lament that the revolution has not yet succeeded." The young man nodded thoughtfully, and after a moment of silence, he added, "What Mr. Wu said is absolutely true. It is our duty to revitalize China. It is a pity that there are too few heroes in our generation. Apart from Mr. Sun Yixin of the Tang Mingri, there is hardly anyone else in the world. I apologize for the offense, but I think Mr. Sun is not worthy of being a hero," Wu Shouting suddenly said. Although he respected Sun Yat-sen very much, he did not think Sun Yat-sen was a heroic figure. Sun Yat-sen has been revolutionizing his whole life, but he has always been in failure. Even if the revolution of 1911 succeeded, strictly speaking, it was not Sun Yat-sen's fault. During the revolution of 1911, Sun Yat-sen was still far abroad and was not even aware of the domestic uprising. His only contribution was his deeply rooted revolutionary theory, which contributed to the reality of this revolution. The young man's expression changed, and he said coldly, "If Sun Yat-sen can't be called a hero, I really don't know anyone in the world who can be called a hero." Wu Shouting was not annoyed by the young people's reaction. He knew very well that Sun Yat-sen's greatness in the hearts of these young intellectuals during this period was like a beacon in the darkness and a mentor of life beliefs. "Sir, in my opinion, Sun Yat-sen can be said to be a great man of this era. Great men and heroes can sometimes be compared with each other, but there are differences between the two." He smiled lightly and said, "To put it bluntly, I am willing to regard Sun Yat-sen as a revolutionary pioneer, follow his doctrine and spirit, and use his doctrine and spirit as the criterion for struggle." "Oh, really?" The young man's face immediately became relieved, but he knew that Wu Shouting had more to say, so he was not in a hurry to express his opinion. "It's just that I don't dare to compliment Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary actions. When I was in Germany, I always paid attention to the domestic news, including the Pingliuli uprising 2 years ago, the Huanggang uprising, Huizhou uprising, and Qinlianfangcheng uprising last year." Wu Shouting told everything he knew about the Tongmenghui uprising before 1908 in one breath. Of course, these uprisings were not necessarily planned and organized by Sun Yat-sen himself, but he only meant the revolutionary forces led by Sun Yat-sen. He paused and then added, "Just 3 days ago, when the ship was anchored in Malaya, Malaysia had not yet been established at this time. The dock workers also rumored that Mr. Sun personally led a Zenangwan uprising at the end of last year. So many uprisings, so long. But what is the result? Needless to say, these uprisings were failures. Even the failure of the Pingliuli uprising and the Huizhou uprising caused the revolutionaries to suffer great losses, and many elite members of the Tongmenghui died as martyrs." After hearing Wu Shouting's words, the young man's expression became solemn again, and he sighed slowly. "But Mr. Wu, you must understand that revolution is an arduous exploration. No one knows how long this road is and how long it will take. But we cannot stop moving forward because of this. As Mr. Wu said, the party members have failed in repeated uprisings in recent years, but I believe that every failure is an accumulation," he said insistently, but his tone was not a rebuttal, but a helpless one. Chapter 3: Cruise Adventure. When I was in Germany, I heard a philosopher named Hegel. He had a famous saying, "Existence is justified." I dare to use this sentence to infer that the Tongmenghui uprising led by Mr. Sun failed many times, so there must be certain reasons. We in China also have a famous saying, "Learning from the past is the guide for the future." Since it has failed repeatedly, why not think deeply about the reasons and try to find other feasible methods? Wu Shouting said unhurriedly. There was a feeling in the young man's heart. He felt that Wu Shouting's words hit the mark. Why do repeated uprisings fail repeatedly? Have the revolutionaries examined the reasons for their failure, or have they examined the results of solving the problem? He sighed secretly and then asked, "So, you think Sun Yat-sen is not worthy of leading the Tongmenghui?" Wu Shouting laughed and said, "My husband asked me earlier why Sun Yat-sen cannot be called a hero. In fact, my answer is just my personal opinion. This is nothing more than everyone's different definition of a hero." The young man was a little surprised, even a little confused. Wu Shouting added, "Strictly speaking, my above answer is aimed at the revolutionary faction represented by Mr. Sun, not Mr. Sun personally. As for whether the alliance should be led by Mr. Sun, I cannot answer this question. But as you said, sir, revolution is about exploration. Mr. Sun can take on this important task and lead our generation to find light in the darkness. This courage and spirit are worthy of the respect of the world." The young man nodded deeply and said with deep approval, "This is exactly the truth." Wu Shouting said, "Having said that, if Mr. Sun doesn't go to hell, who can go to hell? Who dares to go to hell? Therefore, this is the greatness of Mr. Sunday. It's a pity that I have never seen a heroic act." The young man nodded again in agreement, feeling relieved a lot. Young Master Wu has such far-sighted insights, which is very valuable. "So, what do you think Mr. Wu thinks of the current revolutionary situation in our country?" he asked again. Wu Shouting felt a little strange at this time. He originally thought that this young man was an overseas student who was influenced by revolutionary ideas, but the other person kept talking about revolution again and again. Could it be that he was a member of the Tongmenghui? However, even members of the alliance are normal. The alliance has already flourished, and there are countless grassroots members. He pondered for a moment and said, "I don't dare to whisper about such a profound topic. However, Through the information I have collected in Germany over the years, I feel that the revolutionary situation has become very clear. The Chinese people are becoming more and more aware of the pedantry of the Qing government and the bullying of the foreign powers. Now, there is only one spark to start this prairie fire. The young man was startled, then muttered Wu Xiaoding's words and said, "A single spark can start a prairie fire. Okay, this is a good metaphor." He sighed and then said, "But I don't understand. When will this spark appear?" Wu Xiaoding said, "All the uprisings planned by the Tongminghui over the years are nothing more than to ignite the fire of revolution. Unfortunately, it is obvious that their timing, methods, and firepower were not grasped properly. However, I believe that this kind of exploration will succeed sooner or later. I only hope that the revolutionaries can seriously explore the reasons for each failure and not repeat the same mistakes again." At this moment, the passengers who had had dinner in the cabin came to the deck one after another to get some fresh air. Now that there are many eyes and ears around, Wu Xiaoding and the young man stopped talking about what they were talking about. However, the young man looked very interested and said with a smile, "I admire Mr. Wu's previous opinions very much. Have you asked Mr. Wu for his name?" Wu Xiaoding replied, "I'm Wu Xiaoding, courtesy name Jinji. I haven't asked for advice." The young man cupped his hands and said, "I am Hu Hanmin, whose courtesy name is Jiantong." Wu Xiaoding was shocked at that time. Hu Hanmin, a famous revolutionary, one of Sun Yat-sen's main assistants, the first governor of Guangdong after the revolution of 1911, and a Kuomintang veteran as famous as Chiang Kai-shek and Liao Zhangkai. He was very fortunate that when he had a previous conversation with the other party, what he said was accurate, and he would not offend the future big shot inexplicably. Although Hu Hanmin was not that famous at this time in 1908, after all, he was a potential stock, and he still needed to make more connections. He smiled politely and said, "I'm glad to meet you. I just talked to Mr. Hu. Could it be that Mr. Hu is a revolutionary?" Hu Hanmin smiled noncommittally and said, "Master Wu, you have said before that no passionate man will sit back and watch China be destroyed at the hands of the Tartars. So it can be said that anyone who is passionate is a revolutionary. I believe that Master Wu is also a good man who is passionate." Wu Xiaoding felt that Hu Hanmin's words were quite suggestive, as if he was deliberately trying to win him over to join the revolution. He sighed solemnly and said, "It's a pity that the road ahead is unclear, and I'm just a fool in this chaotic country." Hu Hanmin said, "These words are serious. I heard Mr. Wu talk freely before, and Hu already knew that Mr. Wu is not a thing in the pool. Today, Hu is acting like a good boy, but he is licking his face and willing to make friends with Mr. Wu. Isn't it such an honor?" Wu Xiaoding laughed. He was eager to make friends with Hu Hanmin. Immediately, he said repeatedly, "As the saying goes, you rely on your parents at home and your friends when you go out. If you are brothers all over the world, it is also a happy thing in life. Why not do it?" Hu Hanmin reached out and patted Wu Xiaoding's shoulder enthusiastically and said with a smile, "That's very good, very good. May I ask, Brother Zhen, do you have any plans to return to China after completing your studies?" Wu Xiaoding's expression gradually became a little heavy. In fact, this issue was currently weighing on his mind, and he didn't know what to do after he got off the ship. He sighed slowly and said, "My mother died of illness when I was young, and I heard the bad news about my family's strictness 2 years ago. The unfilial son was not able to come back from Germany to keep his mourning. Now my family is in decline, and my relatives and friends have not contacted me. Before returning to China, the officials of the consulate in Germany told me that after returning to China, I can submit my resume to the Guangdong Army Yamen officer, and the Yamen will arrange for admission and distribution. Now I can only plan this way and stabilize my livelihood first." Hu Hanmin nodded thoughtfully. He knew that Wu Xiaoding, a top military student studying abroad in Germany, would not find a way out, and if Wu Xiaoding was assigned to serve in the army, he would also be a potential revolutionary target. He said, "Who has many friends in the provincial capital and will stay temporarily in the provincial capital in the past few months. If Shinji needs any help, who will do his best? Wu's shouting felt a little funny. He felt that Hu Hanmin would ask him for help in the future. However, he knew that this was Hu Hanmin's kindness, so he thanked him. Cousin John is too polite. However, since Cousin John is temporarily staying in the provincial capital, if I am lucky, I will be assigned to serve in the provincial capital by the Yamen. I hope to get closer to Cousin John in the future. After all, I have just returned from Germany and do not have many friends in China. It is a coincidence that I met Cousin John here today. Very good, very good. Hu Hanmin readily agreed. Chapter 4 Farewell at the Dock. 2 days later, the Buckingham sailed into the Pearl River and was expected to arrive at the Guangzhou Pier at 3 p.m. After having lunch, the passengers returned to their cabins and began to check their luggage and prepare for disembarkation. When Wu Shouting boarded the ship from the UK, he purchased a ticket for a second-class cabin, which was a separate room. At this moment, he, like everyone else, is packing his luggage. He opened his suitcase and found that in addition to a set of German army uniforms, there were only 2 sets of summer and winter clothes, the graduation certificate, the outstanding cadet cross, and the straight Browning pistol were all packed in an iron box. As for his own money bag, except for a few Reich marks and 30 silver dollars exchanged from the consulate before leaving, he had nothing left. These were all his possessions. As soon as the luggage was packed, the Buckingham sounded a distant and dull whistle, announcing that it had officially entered the terminal port of the journey. The sound of waiters knocking door to door was heard in the corridor, urging passengers to pick up their luggage and go to the deck to wait for disembarkation. Wu Shouting picked up his suitcase, opened the door, and walked out, arriving on the deck. At this time, the deck was crowded with passengers of all kinds, including Chinese, Westerners, and fake foreigners who were neither Chinese nor Western. He looked towards the front of the cruise ship for a while and saw that the Guangzhou pier was very lively, crowded, and bustling with people. Jinji. A familiar voice came from behind. Wu Shouting turned around and saw Hu Hanmin walking out of the cabin holding his own salute. Hu Hanmin also lived in the second-class cabin, so the two of them had close contact during these 2 days. However, since the first time we discussed the topic of revolution on the deck, other times we just discussed some foreign experiences. Wu Shouting greeted him with a smile and said, "Cousin John, it seems we are about to say goodbye." Hu Hanmin walked over and said with a smile, "Why bother to say these words in a hurry? Or come and sit at my place for a while after you get off the boat. I can introduce a few friends to you." Wu Shouting thought for a while and said, "I'm afraid it won't be inconvenient to disturb you today. I have to rush to the Army Yamen before dark to hand in my resume. Otherwise, I will have to sleep on the street tonight." Hu Hanmin nodded slightly and said, "That's fine. I'll leave you an address after we get off the ship. When you're settled, remember to send someone to notify me." Wu Shouting smiled and said, "Of course." At this time, the Buckingham made another deep whistle, and the ship gradually slowed down. Soon the cruise ship sailed into the passenger port of Guangzhou Wharf. A group of people suddenly rushed up to the wharf. People receiving relatives and friends, dock workers, and rickshaw drivers. It was suddenly crowded. The cruise ship finally put down the sampan, and the sailors cleared a path between the deck and the shore, allowing first and second-class passengers to get off the ship first, and finally the third-class passengers' turn. Wu Shouting and Hu Hanmin stepped off the boat together. When they arrived at the pier, Hu Hanmin was about to invite Wu Shouting to leave the port first and say goodbye outside the pier. But suddenly a cry came from the crowd. "Jean-Tong, Jean-Tong, this way." Wu Shouting and Hu Hanmin both looked towards the place where the sound came from and saw several people in suits squeezing towards them in the crowd. Looking carefully, it seems that none of these people have braids on the back of their heads. Since they know Hu Hanmin, 10 of them should be members of the Tongmenghui. "Jinji, my friend is here to pick me up. Come, you come with me, and I will introduce you," Hu Hanmin said, pulling Wu Shouting and asking him to follow him. Wu Shouting naturally followed along. Everyone met at the railing of the pier. The men in suits shook hands with Hu Hanmin enthusiastically one by one. One of the youngest students even took the luggage from Hu Hanmin first. Then Hao San saw that Wu Xiaoding had come with Hu Hanmin and was about to step forward to take Wu Xiaoding's luggage as well. "Zhantong, you're all right. The boat's schedule said it would arrive at the port at noon, but it was a full 3 hours late, so we had to wait," said a fat middle-aged man with a Hunan accent. "Why? Did Mr. Nanyang send a friend to come back with you?" Another young man wearing glasses, with a thin head and a mustache, said with a smile, and looked at Wu Xiaoding beside him. Hu Hanmin laughed for a while, then introduced Wu Xiaoding. "This is a new friend I made on the ship. He just returned from German military school." At this point, he lowered his voice and said, "This new friend also has his own opinions on revolution." The fatter middle-aged man from earlier raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "Really? That's really good." Wu Xiaoding bowed his hands to Hu Hanmin's 3 friends and said with a polite smile, "My Excellency Wu Xiaoding, courtesy name Jinji. It's a pleasure to meet you all." Hu Hanmin pointed to the fat middle-aged man and said, "This is my close friend. His name is Wang Shoujing from Changsha, Hunan." Wu Xiaoding's face changed slightly, and the name Wang Shoujing was quite familiar in his mind. He contacted that the other person was from Hunan and was slightly fat. He was most likely Huang Xing, another veteran figure of the alliance. Huang Xing is almost as famous as Sun Yat-sen. Because he had frequently participated in uprisings in recent years, he had already been listed as wanted by the Qing government. For this reason, Huang Xing used several pseudonyms to hide his identity, including Wang Shoujing. Although Wu Xiaoding was somewhat sure, it was still inconvenient to say it at this time, so he could only pretend to be normal and signal to Wang Xiaoding with a straight jaw. Hu Hanmin introduced the young man wearing glasses and said, "This is a well-known scholar in Guangzhou, Zhu Dafu, whose courtesy name is Jixin. He is currently teaching at the Guangdong University of Higher Education and the School of Law and Politics." Wu Xiaoding secretly lamented that following Hu Hanmin today, he really got to know many revolutionary heroes. Zhu Jixin was also a well-known figure after the revolution of 1911. When the Guangdong military government was established, he was responsible for reorganizing the entire army of Guangdong province. Of course, Zhu Jixin's greatest achievement was his predictive analysis of socialism. He can be said to be the first-generation preacher of Marxism and Engelsism in China. He translated the famous Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. Hu Hanmin pointed to the last young student and said, "He is Chen Yunsheng. He is studying at the School of Law and Politics. This year should be the 4th semester." Wu Xiaoding didn't know much about Chen Yunsheng. Maybe he was just a little-known character. Everyone exchanged greetings for a while, and Zhu Jixin said, "Don't talk too much. Come on, I've already booked a restaurant. It won't be too late for everyone to catch up on old times when we get there. Jinji will go with us." Chapter 5, Army Yamen. Wu Xiaoding politely declined and said, "I'm in a hurry to go to the Yamen to report. When everything is settled, I will be the host before I come back to invite you all." Hu Hanmin excused Wu Xiaoding and said, "Zhenji traveled across the ocean for several years and just returned to China today. Therefore, there are still many things to take care of, so let Jinji go first." After he finished speaking, he turned to Wu Xiaoding and warned him again, "After you report Jinji, remember to send someone to tell me, and I will write you an address." Immediately, he wrote his temporary address in Guangzhou on a note and handed it to Wu Xiaoding. Wu Xiaoding agreed with a smile and said, "I don't dare to forget. So, everyone, I'll take my leave first." Hu Hanmin, Zhu Jixin, and others said goodbye to Wu Xiaoding here. After Wu Xiaoding disappeared from the pier exit with a flow of people, Wang Shoujing couldn't help but tug at the corner of Hu Hanmin's clothes and asked, "Zhantong, is this person reliable?" Hu Hanmin smiled slightly and said, "I don't know his background yet, but when we were on the ship, he discussed some revolutionary insights with me, which benefited me a lot. What we are short of now are comrades serving in the army. Since he has revolutionary tendencies and is about to be assigned a military position, he is exactly the person we want to fight for." Zhantang, does he know your identity? Hu Jixin asked. I didn't tell him my identity, but he should have guessed it. It doesn't matter. Even if young people like him don't join the revolution, they won't betray us. Hu Hanmin said confidently. Wang Shoujing nodded and said, that would be the best. We should contact him more in the future. Hu Hanmin smiled and said, this is natural. Wu Xiaoding left the pier, called a rickshaw, and went directly to the Guangdong Army Yamen. The 6th Army Yamen is located at the end of a street in the western suburbs of Dejiacheng. It took a rickshaw more than half an hour to get here. After paying the fare, the driver enthusiastically helped Wu Xiaoding carry his luggage to the Yamen door. The building of this Yamen still maintains its simplicity, with a vermilion gate and pink and white courtyard walls. On the door beam hangs 4 large Chinese characters, Juju and Yamen, in block letters. But the strange thing is that this is a military institution after all, and there are no guards at the gate. Wu Xiaoding packed up his luggage and walked in. When he reached the front yard, he